There is a question that surfaces late at night. The kind of question that doesn't announce itself loudly, but settles in quietly while you're lying still. What if we aren't the first? What if the arc of human complexity, cities and writing, and organised power, and trade networks stretching across continents, has not risen once, but risen and fallen? Risen and fallen, over and over, so many times that the earlier attempts are buried so deep in sediment and myth and time that we barely recognise them for what they were. That's the premise behind the idea that we are the seventh civilization. Not the seventh country or the seventh empire, the seventh distinct chapter of organised human complexity on this planet. Each of the previous six, the idea goes, reached some kind of peak and then collapsed. Some of them slowly, some catastrophically, leaving behind ruins that archaeology is still trying to decipher, or leaving behind almost nothing at all. And we, with our satellites and our antibiotics and our 8 billion lives humming along on this one small world, are Chapter 7. Now, before we go any further, I want to be honest with you. That framing, the exact number 7, is more poetic than scientific. Nobody is going to publish a peer-reviewed paper confirming the official civilization count. But what is real, what is genuinely supported by archaeology and geology and genetics, is the underlying pattern. Complex societies have risen and collapsed repeatedly. Entire ecosystems have been remade. Biospheres have been restructured. Some of the resets have been slow and quiet, unfolding over centuries until the people living through them didn't even know they were living through a collapse. Others have been sudden and violent and total, the kind that end in hours. And the deeper you go into not just human history, but into the history of life on this planet, the more resets you find. This video is going to take you through all of them. If you're here to fall asleep, that's exactly what this is made for. Find a comfortable position. Close your eyes if you want. And if you're awake enough to leave a comment, tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there right now. I genuinely read them. There's something remarkable about seeing people in Tokyo at dawn and people in Chicago at midnight, all inhabiting the same quiet moment together. The geography of insomnia is its own kind of civilization. So, what do people actually mean when they say we are the seventh civilization? The answer depends a little on who's asking. Some mean it spiritually, drawing on ancient traditions that speak of worlds before this one, ages of gold and silver and bronze that declined into the present age of iron. Hindu cosmology has its yugas, great cycles of time stretching back almost incomprehensibly far. Mesoamerican traditions speak of suns, complete worlds that were created and then destroyed before the current one. Norse myth has ages of gods and giants. These stories are not geology, but they are also not nothing. They are the echo of something the human mind keeps returning to, felt sense that this is not the beginning of the story. Others use the seventh civilization framing more literally, pointing to specific archaeological cultures that rose and then ended. Bronze Age palace economies, the cities of the Indus Valley, Akkadian Empire, the Roman world. Stack those up and count the collapses, and you start to get a list that might justify a number like 6 or 7, depending on how you define the borders between one era and the next. And then there are the researchers who go further back than any human civilization, into the deep time record of the planet itself, find collapses of a different magnitude entirely. Mass extinctions that erased most complex life, supervolcanic events that dimmed the sun for years, an impact 66 million years ago that ended a dynasty lasting hundreds of millions of years. By that count, the number 6 or 7 seems almost modest. What this video is going to do is hold all 3 of those frames at once. We're going to move through myth, and where it overlaps with real geological or archaeological events. We're going to walk through specific historical collapses and what actually caused them, not the oversimplified one-line explanations, the tangled, usually uncomfortable real stories involving drought and disease, and trade, breakdown, and decisions made by people who had no idea they were living at the end of something. And we're going to go even further back, into the supervolcanoes and the impacts and the glaciations, because the story of collapse is not only a human story, it is an Earth story. Now here is the thread I want you to hold on to as we go. It connects all of these different eras and scales. Complex systems, whether they're ecosystems or empires or trade networks or biospheres, tend to become more efficient as they grow. They specialize. They interlock. Each part depends on other parts, and that efficiency is also a fragility. The more tightly coupled a system becomes, the more a disruption in one corner can cascade through the whole thing. You'll see that pattern in the Bronze Age. You'll see it in the Indus Valley, see it in the Roman climate window, and you'll see it, if you look carefully, in the extinction events that cleared the way for the age of mammals or the age of dinosaurs before them. The civilizations didn't all fail for the same reason, but many of them failed through a version of the same dynamic. A crowd, a system, optimized for one set of conditions, suddenly confronted with different ones, with no slack left in the architecture to absorb the shock. We're going to be curious about all of this rather than certain. The honest answer to many of these questions is that we don't fully know. We have fragments. We have proxies, pollen cores, and isotope ratios, and broken pottery, and flood myths, passed down through 40 generations. We are archaeologists of deep time, squinting at very incomplete evidence. But the picture that emerges, even from the fragments, genuinely astonishing. So settle in. We're going to go back a very long way, and somewhere in all of it, you might find yourself thinking about the world we're living in right now, and what it might look like from a very long distance. Before we start counting civilizations and cataloguing their endings, we need to spend a moment on the definitions. Host, because this is where a lot of conversations about lost worlds goes sideways. People use words like civilization and collapse as if everyone agrees on what they mean. And then they end up talking past each other, or worse, making dramatic claims that dissolve the moment you ask what exactly is being claimed. Or at least, let's be honest about the imprecision. When archaeologists and historians talk about civilization, they're usually pointing to a cluster of markers that tend to appear together. Cities, meaning dense permanent settlements with enough population that strangers have to cooperate and develop systems to manage that cooperation. Writing, or at minimum, some form of record keeping that lets information outlive the people who originally held it. State-level political organisation, which is a formal way of saying a power structure that extends beyond what one person or one family can personally oversee. Trade networks that reach beyond the immediate region, pulling in materials and ideas from distant places. And specialization, people who spend their lives making pottery or keeping accounts or building temples instead of growing all their own food, which means the whole system depends on enough surplus to support people who aren't farmers. None of these things appears suddenly. Every one of them has a prehistory stretching back into simpler forms. and they don't always appear together in the same order or the same combination. The Indus Valley cities had remarkable urban planning and standardized weights and measures, but left us a writing system. We still can't read. Some societies developed complex trade networks without obvious cities. The definition is more like a constellation than a checklist. You're looking for enough of the stars to recognize the shape. Now, what counts as a wipeout? This is where it gets more complicated, because the word collapse tends to flatten a lot of very different things into one dramatic image of everything falling apart at once. The actual history of how complex societies end is considerably more varied and considerably more interesting. There's true population crash, which is the most extreme version. People die in large numbers. Settlements are abandoned, not because the inhabitants moved on, but because they couldn't survive. This is what happened in parts of the Americas after European contact, where introduced diseases killed somewhere between 50 and 90% of the indigenous populations. Within a few generations, that is civilizational destruction in the most literal sense. Then there's abandonment, which is different. Maya lowland cities were not destroyed by plague or invasion. They were walked away from. The populations dispersed into smaller settlements or moved to other regions. The knowledge survived. The people survived. The urban centres left to the jungle. Whether that counts as collapse depends heavily on your definition. The cities fell. The civilization continued in altered form. There's conquest and absorption, where one society is overtaken by another, and the culture is partially preserved, partially erased, and partially transformed into something new. Persian Empire absorbed dozens of older cultures. The Roman Empire absorbed and transformed the Greek world. Things end, but they also continue, just wearing different clothes. And then there's assimilation, the slow version, where a society changes so gradually and thoroughly over centuries that at some point you realize it has become something fundamentally different without any single moment of collapse. You could argue that's what happened to the Western Roman world. It didn't fall so much as it transformed, unevenly and painfully, and over a very long time, into the fragmented post-Roman world of medieval Europe. The distinction matters. Because when someone says a civilization was wiped out, they might mean any of these things, and the story is very different depending on which one they mean. Now here's the part that changes how you think about all of this. Preservation problem. We are not reading the full record. We are reading what survived, and what survived is a small and unrepresentative sample of what existed. Think about what your own life would leave behind in 10,000 years. Not the conversations, not the relationships, not the beliefs, or the songs, or the stories your grandparents told. Maybe some metal objects, maybe some concrete foundations if the conditions were right. Maybe, if you were very lucky, a fragment of text inscribed in something durable. The softer and more organic a material, the more completely it disappears. Wood rots, cloth disintegrates, leather vanishes. Even bone requires very specific conditions to survive for millennia. This means that every archaeological record we have is weighted toward societies that built in stone, that inscribed things in clay or carved them into rock, that lived in climates dry enough to slow decay, and that happened to end up buried in conditions favourable to preservation. Societies that built in wood, that kept their records on perishable materials, that lived in wet tropical environments. Those societies could be extraordinarily complex and leave almost no trace at all. This is what researchers sometimes call preservation bias, and it shapes everything we think we know about the deep human past. The absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. That's not just a philosophical nicety. It is a practical constraint on every claim we make about what existed and what didn't, which brings us to something useful called the garbage layer idea. What durable traces does a society actually leave behind? What? Not what it intended to leave, not its monuments and inscriptions, which are already a biased sample representing power and wealth, but what it accidentally left. The middens, the trash heaps, the fire pits, the accidental spills, the things nobody thought to clean up or preserve. These tend to be more honest records than the official ones. Is that the farther back you go, thinner the garbage layer gets. Not necessarily because societies were simpler, but because the materials they used were less durable, the time available for destruction is longer. 10,000 years is enough time for a wooden city to vanish completely. 20,000 is enough for most organic settlements to leave nothing but faint chemical traces in the soil. 100,000 years, and even stone structures, may be buried under dozens of meters of sediment, subducted under tectonic plates, drowned under sea level changes that have reshaped the coastlines where most humans have always preferred to live. Understand that, and you start to appreciate why the question of whether complex societies existed further back than we currently know is genuinely open in a way that standard textbook history of civilization doesn't quite communicate. But here's the line we need to hold, the one between genuine inquiry and wishful thinking. The fact that evidence can disappear does not mean that we should assume the disappeared evidence was there. That's not how reasoning works. What it means is that we should be honest about the limits of our knowledge, stay curious about anomalies in the record, take seriously the work of researchers who are looking in unconventional places and maintain a clear distinction between what we know, what we can plausibly infer, and what we are speculating. There's also a scale problem worth naming. A local collapse is not the same as a global civilizational reset. Societies have been collapsing somewhere throughout all of recorded and unrecorded history. Villages were abandoned during the last ice age. Trading networks have broken down and reformed dozens of times. What would constitute a genuinely global reset? A wiping of the civilizational slate, something much rarer and much harder to claim. For that to happen, you would need not just the end of one culture or one region's complexity, but a disruption, severe enough that organized society itself became impossible. Across wide areas simultaneously, no continuity of knowledge into what followed. Some of the events we'll look at came close to that at regional scales. Few of the deep time events may have achieved it in a sense that dwarfs anything in human history. The claim that there have been 6 full global resets of human-level civilization before ours is a claim that requires extraordinary evidence, because it is an extraordinary claim. And the honest answer is that we don't have that evidence. What we have is a record of repeated collapses of varying scales, a severe preservation problem that leaves the deeper past genuinely uncertain, and a set of myths and traditions from around the world that describe catastrophic resets in language that sometimes align surprisingly well with what the geological record shows. So we're going to hold the question open. Not because extraordinary claims deserve credulous acceptance, but because extraordinary questions deserve careful exploration. We're going to follow the evidence where it leads, acknowledge where it runs out, and resist the temptation to fill the gaps with either certainty or fantasy. That seems like the right posture for a journey this long, because where we're going next is back to the edge of recorded memory, back to the end of the ice and the great floods that followed, back to the first stories humans told about the world ending. And some of those stories, it turns out, have geological receipts, a host. If you listen to people from very different places and very different times talk about how the world began and how it might end, certain images keep showing up like recurring dreams. There is almost always a time before, a golden age or a first world when things were easier, people were closer to the gods, animals spoke, winters were kinder, lifespans were longer. Sometimes it's described as a literal paradise, sometimes just as a time when the rules were different and the distance between heaven and earth wasn't so wide. Then there is usually a break, fall, a sin, a mistake. Humans offend the gods, or forget a ritual, or grow proud, or simply become too noisy. Sometimes it's not even our fault. The gods fight each other, or some cosmic balance tips. But however it's framed, something about the way things were becomes intolerable to whoever or whatever runs the universe. And then comes the reset, flood that drowns the lowlands, fire that falls from the sky, a winter that doesn't end, a monster that devours everything. The mechanisms vary, the theme is constant. The old world is washed away, burned away, buried under ice or ash, and only a few survivors carry forward into the next age. You can hear versions of this in Mesopotamia, where the gods send a flood and warn Utnapishtim to build a boat. In the Hebrew Bible, where Noah rides out 40 days of rain, while everything around him drowns. In India, where the god Vishnu appears as a fish and helps Manu survive an overwhelming flood. In Greek myths, where Zeus ends a corrupt age with water, and Deucalion and Pyrrha throw stones over their shoulders. To repopulate the earth, sail west, and the pattern doesn't stop. The Maya tell of previous creations destroyed by floods and chaos, humans made and unmade from different substances, until the gods finally get it right. In the Andean highlands, there are stories of a time when water rose to cover the mountains, and a handful of people survived on the highest peaks. In the Pacific, island traditions speak of waves that swallowed whole stretches of land, leaving only scattered summits above the sea. Far to the north, some indigenous traditions in North America tell of a world that once sank beneath the waters and rose again, remade. Others remember fire instead, mountains that exploded, sky that rained embers, a sun that vanished behind smoke while ash fell like snow. On one level, this can all look like coincidence. Water is everywhere. Floods happen everywhere. Fire too. If you're looking for a dramatic way to express the idea of total reset, of judgment, or of a hard boundary between one age and the next, it's not surprising that people reach for elements that can sweep everything clean. When you put these stories next to what the Earth itself is telling us, the coincidence starts to feel less random. We know, from geology and climate science, that the end of the last ice age was not a gentle fade-out. Glaciers that had sat on continents for tens of thousands of years melted. Sometimes in giant pulses, sea level rose more than 100 meters between the peak of the ice age and the relatively stable coastlines we know now. That rise wasn't smooth. There were episodes when meltwater surged into the oceans so quickly that shorelines retreated kilometers. Within a few human lifetimes, if you were living in a village on a coastal plain, watching the sea eat land your grandparents remembered as dry, feel like the world itself was drowning. If you lived in a river valley downstream of a collapsing ice dam, the sudden release of a glacial lake would look and sound like the end of everything. Do you need a divine punishment to explain that in a story? No. Punishment is a way of turning a terrifying, arbitrary event into something with a reason and a lesson. Instead of the ice sheet failed and hydrological feedbacks accelerated melt, you get we angered the gods, or people broke the sacred law. The old age had run its course. That's one of the core things myth does. It takes events that are too big, too complex, too frightening to hold in their raw form, and it wraps them in narrative. And narratives can be carried by memory in ways that raw data can't. Oral traditions are not static recordings. They are living systems. Details shift. Symbols grow. Names change. Some structural elements can be astonishingly stable over long periods of time. Host. There are Aboriginal Australian stories that describe coastal geography as it existed more than 7,000 years ago. Before post-ice age, sea level, rise drowned certain land bridges and lowlands. There are Pacific Northwest stories that line up eerily well with known volcanic eruptions and tsunamis, including waves that struck where we now know a subduction zone earthquake, sent water racing across the ocean. This doesn't mean every myth is a literal eyewitness account. It means that myths can carry kernels of remembered experience, distilled and transformed through generations of retelling. A real flood might become a cosmic deluge. Real meteor streaking overhead might become fire from the sky, sent by angry beings. A volcanic eruption might become a dragon, or a mountain god, or a sun that died and was reborn. You can think of myth as a kind of compression. Take an event, compress it into story, phonos. Survives is what was emotionally and socially important. That the water rose without mercy, that almost everyone died, that a few clever or righteous or lucky people survived by listening or building or climbing or obeying. This is where stories like Atlantis come in. Passen, Plato's tale of an advanced island civilization that angered the gods and sank beneath the sea has become a magnet for every lost civilization theory. Over the centuries, people have tried to pin it to real places, a memory of the Thera eruption in the Aegean, a muddled story of Minoan Crete, echoes of older seafaring cultures filtered through Egyptian lore, or, more mundanely, a pure philosophical invention Plato used as a thought experiment about the dangers of hubris and imperial power. In this script, we're not going to enlist Atlantis as proof of anything. Instead, we can treat it the way we should treat most such stories, as a question generator. Kind of event would inspire a story about a whole world drowned in a single night. Could a volcanic island collapse that fast? Yes, parts of the seafloor and continental shelves gone under within human memory. Absolutely. Are there submerged structures off various coasts that might be old harbours or temples, or simply natural formations? Humans once visited when sea level was lower. Yes, again, myths like Atlantis don't prove those things, but they do tell us where human imagination has gone when it tries to grapple with the idea of civilizational loss. They also tell us something about why these stories persist for thousands of years. They teach morals. Obey the gods, don't grow arrogant, remember limits, care for the balance. They anchor identity. We are the people who survived the flood. Our ancestors came from the drowned land. This mountain saved our lineage. They explain visible puzzles in the landscape, strange ruins half buried in silt, terraces that now vanish into the surf, shells on hilltops, blackened layers in the soil, giant boulders sitting alone in fields, where no ordinary river could have moved them. You're living in a world where you can see evidence of former shorelines, ancient lake beds, fossil reefs high above the current sea. You will look for a story that explains them. Myth is one way of turning geology into genealogy, of tying your people to the deep memory of the land. Here's a simple rule we can carry with us through the rest of this journey. Treat myths as maps of questions, not as ready-made answers cast. When you hear a story about a world-ending flood, let it draw your attention to drowned coastlines, to sediment layers, to sudden climate shifts. When a tradition speaks of fire from the sky, look for impact craters, for tektites, for traces of ancient wildfires. When people remember ages of darkness or ages of endless winter, compare those tales with ice cores, with volcanic ash layers, known episodes of abrupt cooling. Sometimes the alignment will be eerie, sometimes it will be weak or non-existent. Either way, the next step is the same. You test, you measure, you dig, you cross-check. You let the story suggest where to look, and then you let the rocks and the ice and the DNA tell you what actually happened. Hold on to the stories, because they are part of what makes us human. But hold just as firmly to the methods that let us to distinguish memory from metaphor, metaphor from material fact. Because now we're going to follow one of those recurring stories down into the ground. The story of the time when ice ruled the north, and then melted, and the waters rose higher than anyone thought possible. First world ended in ice and meltwater. The myths remember pieces of it. The planet keeps the receipts. To find that world, you have to change the map in your mind. Take the globe you know and rewind it about 21,000 years to what geologists call the last glacial maximum. Freeze the animation and look around. Sea level is more than 100 meters lower. Whole continental shelves that are now hidden under water are dry land. The North Sea basin is not a sea at all, but a vast plain of grass and rivers linking what we now call Britain to Europe. The islands of Indonesia are fused into a subcontinent, Sunda, stretching almost unbroken from mainland Asia down toward Australia. To the east, there is another bridge, Sahul, connecting Australia, New Guinea, Tasmania, into one continuous landmass. If you walked from what we now call Paris to what we now call London, your feet would never touch a boat. If you lived in Japan, the coast was miles farther out. If your people hunted along the Indian or West African shorelines, your world included broad, fertile coastal plains that are now drowned and invisible on modern maps. Above all this, to the north sits the ice. Not dainty mountain glaciers, great white continents of frozen water. Kilometres, thick in places, squatting over Canada, Scandinavia, the northern United States, parts of Britain and northern Europe. They sag the crust beneath them, like a person on a mattress. Their weight bends the planet itself. South of the ice margins are belts of tundra and steppe, cold, dry grasslands that strangely could be rich in life. Herds of mammoth, bison, wild horse, reindeer. Predator guilds of lions and hyenas in Europe. Giant short-faced bears and dire wolves in the Americas. For humans able to crack the code of that ecosystem, able to track herds, work hides, find shelter in a treeless landscape. This could be a land of abundance. Farther south still, in what are now the tropics and subtropics, the picture is complicated. Some regions are cooler and drier than today. Rainforests shrink or fragment. Lakes drop. Deserts expand. Other regions hold patches of relative stability. refuges where rain still falls and rivers still run. This is the first world we're talking about, a world of exposed shelves and low sea levels, of super bridges between continents, climates and coasts that do not match the lines we are used to seeing. Humans in this world were not blank slates waiting for civilization to be invented. They were already expert navigators of Ice Age geography, already carrying stone tool traditions, fire management, complex social ties, shared languages and myths. They settled river mouths, estuaries, coastal plains, because that's where food tends to pool. Fish runs, shellfish beds, waterfowl, rich soils for wild grains and tubers, that choice. Perfectly reasonable, perfectly adaptive in their own time, created a kind of trap for our archaeology. Climate shifted out of the Ice Age. It didn't do so politely. From about 20,000 years ago to about 7,000 years ago, ice sheets retreated, and meltwater flowed relentlessly toward the sea. Global sea level rose more than 100 meters over that span. On average, several millimeters a year. But the average hides the drama. The record in corals and sediments suggests bursts, meltwater pulses. When great, chunks of ice sheet collapsed or reorganized, and the oceans may have risen meters in just a few centuries. Imagine your coastline walking inland, year after year, a bay eating past the old dune line, over fields, over camps, over burial grounds. Your grandparents remember gathering shellfish. At a beach that is now part of the seabed, parents built their houses on a safe terrace that now floods at the highest tides. Your own children grow up. That though the water used to be farther away, that there were once more lands out there, people lived and then did not. The first world ends not in a single Hollywood wave, but in a drawn-out drowning, punctuated by sudden panics. Now, add to that the climate whiplash inside the broader trend. One of the sharpest jolts we know of is called the Younger Dryas, period of abrupt cooling that began about 12,900 years ago, just when things seem to be warming nicely. In the Greenland ice cores, the shift from nearly modern temperatures back to near glacial cold happens in a matter of decades, maybe even less in some regions. Then, after about 1,000 years of this cold snap, temperatures snap back up again, almost as fast. There are debates about exactly why. The leading ideas involve changes in ocean circulation triggered by big influxes of fresh meltwater into the North Atlantic. But for the people on the ground, the mechanism wouldn't matter. One generation might be telling stories of longer summers and expanding forests, and the next is facing biting winds, failing crops, shifting animal ranges, lakes locked in ice for months longer than anyone remembers. These abrupt events are stress tests on whatever systems people have built. Food first, a hunting strategy tuned to reindeer on open tundra, might fail if forest creeps in, and the herds move or vanish. Foragers, relying on fish runs in a cold, fast river, might suddenly get more than they ever imagined when glacial lakes dump, or much less if spawning grounds are stranded or silted. Wild grains that ripen predictably under one climate regime might flicker out under another. Migration routes shift. Passes that were safe become buried in snow. Coastal pathways are interrupted by new inlets and fjords. Land bridges that once carried bands and languages are severed by rising seas. A path your ancestors walked for generations becomes an ocean trench. Stress squeezes people together in refuges. Valleys that keep moisture, coasts that stay mild, oases where groundwater still reaches the surface, where humans crowd, conflict can flare. Competition over hunting territories, water sources, the last stands of forest. But the same squeezing can spark innovation. Under pressure, people experiment with new food sources, new tools, new social deals. In some parts of the world, that pressure cooker environment in the late glacial and early Holocene seems to correlate with the beginnings of plant, tending and animal management. Not all at once, not as a grand invention in one place, but as scattered local solutions. Encouraging useful plants, storing seeds, keeping semi-tame animals near camp, gradually shifting from pure foraging to something like gardening and herding. The key point for our story is that none of this happened on an empty earth. There were worlds of human practice, of seasonal rounds, of sacred sites, half-permanent settlements that rose and fell on landscapes we cannot easily see. Many of the richest of those landscapes, the continental shelves, broad coastal plains, are now drowned. Their hearths, their middens, their fish weirs and wooden structures, and maybe, in some cases, surprisingly elaborate sites, lie under tens of metres of water and mud. Underwater archaeology is beginning to nibble at this hidden record. Divers and sonar surveys have mapped drowned river channels in the North Sea plain, found worked flints and possible structures on shelves off India, the Mediterranean, the Americas, Australia. But the ocean is big, cold, dark, and expensive to search. What we've seen so far is almost certainly a tiny fraction of what exists. This is one reason why the question, where are the ruins of the lost civilizations, is trickier than it sounds. Culture flourished on a coastal plain for a few thousand years at the end of the Ice Age, then drowned as seas rose. Most of its traces would be underwater today. And if that culture's material footprint was mostly wood, bone, earthworks, modest stone, rather than skyscrapers and steel, the ocean and its sediments would erase or bury most of it in short order. So when we talk about the first world ending in ice and meltwater, we're not imagining the literal extinction of our species. Humans made it through. In fact, our genetic and cultural lineages tell us we were present before, during, and after every pulse of sea level rise, every cold snap, every sudden flood. The wipeout in this case is something softer, and in some ways more unsettling. It's the fragmentation of worlds into disconnected pieces, the splitting of once continuous coasts into islands, the loss of shared meeting grounds, common pathways, of lowland basins, where different groups once traded and intermarried. It's the dispersal of communities, forced to climb to higher ground, to abandon ancestral fishing grounds and burial places now under the waves. From the point of view of any one group, might have felt total. Your homeland gone, your sacred places drowned. Your neighbours vanished over the horizon. The stories you tell your children would start, not with an abstract ice sheet, but with something like, once there was more land, once we walked where the sea now is. Once the world was wider, and then it shrank. And as that first ice and water world broke apart, shorelines crept inland and climates lurched. Humans did what we always do. Moved, they fought, they adapted, they invented. In the sheltered pockets where conditions stabilized, new ways of living would slowly emerge. Villages that stayed put a little longer each year, harvests that depended less on wandering herds and more on what humans themselves planted and stored. Experiments in permanence, in walls and fields and inherited plots. Those experiments are what we usually mean when we talk about civilization, but they came after a long age of rising water, after a world that is hard for us to see, and harder still to imagine clearly, because so much of it lies offshore under the waves. The first great ending we're tracing here wasn't the death of humanity, it was the death of a map. A rearrangement of coasts and climates so profound that, from the human point of view, it might as well have been the end of a world and the beginning of another. The people who lived through it carried the memory forward in stories of floods and lost lands. The shorelines carried it forward in drowned river mouths and buried forests, and out of the survivors, unknowingly, came the lineages that would one day build cities and learn, for the first time, that even cities could fail. By the time the seas had mostly stopped climbing and the ice had retreated to its modern shadows, some of those long experiments in staying put had taken on a new shape. They became cities. Not the planet-spanning megastructures of science fiction, not yet, but dense knots of people and storage and rules. Places where the human tendency to gather, trade, argue, dream, pooled in one spot long enough to leave a mark you can still see in the ground. You can pick almost any river valley in the right latitudes and see the pattern appear. Staggered in time, but similar in outline. In Mesopotamia, Tigris and Euphrates carried meltwater and mountain silt across a broad, flat plain. Floods spread thin sheets of nutrient-rich mud in the low places where people could manage those floods. Digging ditches, throwing up levees, guiding water into fields. Grain yields exploded. Villages along canals swelled into something more. Farther, east, along the Nile, the pattern was even more regular. The river rose and fell with a rhythm that could be learned, roughly predictable, turning narrow strips of desert edge into ribbons of black soil. Villages stretched along the banks like beads on a cord, tied together by the current. To the east again, in the Indus Basin, seasonal rivers braided and rebraided themselves across an enormous alluvial fan. When they behaved, they watered vast tracts of land that could support compact, brick-built towns. To the north, in the foothills of the Zagros and Taurus, small farming villages clustered where rainfall alone was enough. On the Yellow River in China, lowest soils, fine, wind-blown dust, were easy to dig and astonishingly fertile if you could keep them in place. Different languages, different crops, different gods, but the same basic move. Take a landscape where water pulses through, not too little, not too much. Add domestic plants and animals that tie you to the soil. Wheat and barley, sheep and goats, later rice, and millet and cattle, layer on storage, granaries, pots, underground silos, so that the pulse of harvest can be stretched across the hunger months. Then add people willing to specialize. Some who mostly farm, some who mostly craft, some who mostly fight, some who mostly count and remember. At a certain scale, a village becomes something qualitatively different. You get districts. You get public buildings. You get signs of authorities who can command labour for things that don't directly feed their builders. Temples, palaces, platforms, walls. The earliest true cities we know, like Uruk in southern Mesopotamia, look in the archaeological record like a sudden outburst of complexity. A few centuries, farm hamlets are overshadowed by a settlement that may have held tens of thousands of people. There are layers of baked brick, networks of canals, standardized clay tablets, with marks that are beginning to look like writing. But if you strip away the romance, what made these early cities work is almost disappointingly simple. They were machines for turning predictable harvests into predictable power. If you can irrigate a field and get 3 or 4 times the grain that rain alone would give you, you can feed more people per acre. If you can count that grain as it comes in, store it in central facilities, and redistribute it as rations or wages, you can keep craft workers and soldiers and priests alive even when they don't farm. If you can write down who owes what to whom, you can extend promises and debts over time. Grain, record-keeping hierarchy. That's the tripod. It's also a recipe for a very special kind of fragility. In a small village, if the harvest fail options, they can tighten belts, dig wild roots, split up and go visit relatives in better-off places. They hurt, but the social fabric is flexible. In an early city, options narrow. Tens of thousands of mouths are concentrated in one spot. Most of those people are no longer directly in control of their own food production. They depend on a web of fields and canals that might be dozens of kilometres away, on schedules for sowing and harvest, on storehouses filling as expected, on officials allocating rations fairly enough that people stay calm. Break any major link in that chain and the system shudders. A drought that pushes yields down for 2 or 3 years in a row. A river channel that shifts a few kilometres, making old canals suddenly useless. Salt building up in irrigated soils after centuries of overwatering, turning once rich fields white and bitter. Raiders disrupting trade routes that supply timber or copper or tin. To a village, these are serious problems. To an early state, they're existential, because now, on top of the basic ecological stress, you have the overlay of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy sounds dull, but for early cities, it's oxygen. Scribes, tax collectors, surveyors, priests. They're all part of the nervous system that keeps grain flowing, boundaries recognised, labour organised. That nervous system becomes too rigid. If it can't adapt quickly, when the river jumps its banks or the rains fail, it can make a bad year into a catastrophe. The paradox is that what makes these early states powerful is exactly what makes them brittle. They are optimised for a narrow band of conditions. Flood levels within a certain range, planting and harvest on a certain schedule, neighbouring powers just threatening enough to justify armies but not strong enough to sack the capital. They build long, delicate chains of dependence, and then assume that tomorrow will look enough like yesterday for those chains to hold. Often, for a while, they do. Host. When they don't, we start using words like collapse. But here we have to be careful. The word suggests something sudden and absolute, building falling in on itself, a light switching off. The archaeological record, more often than not, tells a different story. Take a once grand city mound in Mesopotamia. The uppermost monumental levels might end in a burn layer, a rubble of broken bricks, scatter of sling stones and arrowheads. Above that, the next layers might look quieter. Small houses dug into the ruins, storage pits cut through old floors, burials tucked into former courtyards. The palace is gone. Temple administrators no longer stamp tablets in the big hall. The city walls are unrepaired breaches. If you were a court official from the glory days and you came back as a ghost, you would say, everything has ended. But the people have not vanished. They have thinned, scattered, reorganised. Some move upriver to fresher fields as salinisation advances downstream. Some retreat to villages in the foothills, trading grain farming for mixed herding and gardening. Some hang on in the shadow of the old walls, farming just outside and reusing fallen bricks. From the aerial view of centuries, what looks like a sharp civilizational break is often more like a slow reweaving. Imperial centres flicker out, and the same human families, their cousins, continue in humbler forms. This pattern repeats in different landscapes with different flavours. In the Indus region, great brick cities, Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro and their peers, show signs of gradual change rather than simple destruction. Street drains fall into disrepair, standardised weights and measures become less common. Populations seem to drift towards smaller settlements, sometimes in new ecological niches. Rivers in the region were shifting. Floods may have become less predictable. What fades is not the people, particular way they had been organised. The tight urban grids, the uniform civic standards. In Egypt, there are periods when central authority nearly evaporates. The so-called intermediate periods. Royal monuments stop. Provincial elites carve their own tombs, bragging of local power. But the farming villages along the Nile keep tending their fields, generation after generation. When unity is reimposed under a new dynasty, it often looks suspiciously like a rebranding of structures that never fully disappeared. Again and again, archaeology shows continuity in pottery styles, in house plans, in burial customs, even as the big institutions come and go. God kings fall, tax offices burn. Grand processional ways choke with weeds. But the descendants of the labourers who built them may still be there, now answering to a different title, answering a different title, storing grain in different jars, telling slightly altered stories about the river and the sky. When we stand in front of a ruined ziggurat or look at the eroded outlines of city walls on a satellite image, it's easy to equate the end of that monument, that bureaucracy, that dynasty with the end of a whole civilization. A neat before and after, golden age, then dark age. But if you shift your gaze from the palaces to the farmsteads, the story blurs. Maybe what we're really seeing, most of the time, is not the extinction of a people, but the failure of a particular way of scaling their cooperation. A large, centralised, top-heavy system losing its grip, and many smaller, more flexible systems taking its place. For the people living through it, the loss of the city might feel like the loss of the world. The place where gods were fed and rulers enthroned, markets buzzed and scribes scratched symbols into clay, lies silent. The roads that once carried caravans now sprout thorns, but the language doesn't vanish overnight. The recipes don't. The knowledge of where water lies under the soil, of which stars mark the sowing season, where to find clay that fires well. All of that usually walks on in human bodies. So when we ask how many civilizations came before us, how many worlds have ended, we need to decide what we mean. Are we counting the fall of capitals, the breakup of empires, drying of canals, and the abandonment of neat street grids? If so, the number is large. Instead, we're asking how many times humanity has been knocked all the way back to zero, stripped of accumulated skills and stories, forced to begin again, as if nothing had ever been built. The answer, as far as we can see, is perhaps never in the last 10,000 years. Underneath each apparent ending, there is usually a quieter continuity. Early cities were the first to discover this uncomfortable truth, that you can build a world so elaborate it feels permanent, only to learn that it rests on harvests and habits that can change. Institutions can die while people go on. That what feels like the death of everything might be, in the long run, a reshuffling, a dispersal, chance for different forms of life to take root. And this brings us to one of history's first sharp lessons in environmental shock. Drought so wide and so deep that it shook the earliest empires and showed just how quickly a river-fed world could come apart. The Akkadian Empire is one of the first times on humans tried to knit a whole landscape into a single political fabric. King named Sargon, if the later stories are even half right, started as a cupbearer and ended as king of the Four Quarters. His successors ruled from Akkad, a city we still haven't definitively found, somewhere between the older Sumerian cities of the south and the rain-fed lands to the north. What mattered wasn't just the kings' names, it was what they were sitting on top of. For the first time, southern Mesopotamia's irrigation cities and the drier farming and herding zones of northern Mesopotamia seem to have been brought under one overarching system. Grain and wool and labour could, in theory, be redirected across hundreds of kilometres. Armies marched on roads, stamped with royal names. Governors in distant towns sealed tablets with the same imperial symbols as those in the capital. From the outside, if you could have looked down on that world, around 4,300 years ago, it might have seemed like the final form of the River Valley experiment. Canals and cities and fortresses all humming under one authority. The messy patchwork of earlier city-states finally tamed. It did not last long. A couple of centuries, perhaps 3, and then the written record shifts tone. Texts start talking about the curse of Akkad, about fields that yield nothing, about people wandering, hungry. In later memory, the empire becomes one more lost world, punished by the gods, swallowed by emptiness. When archaeologists and climate scientists go looking for the material story behind those laments, they keep bumping into the same thing. Drought, around 4,200 years ago, give or take, depending on where and how you measure. Something changes in climate records from a wide band, the old world. In Syrian lakes, in cave formations in Iran, in dust deposits off the coast, you see hints of a shift, layers that suggest less rainfall, more dust, cooler surface waters, changes in monsoon strength. It's not as simple as a single switch being flipped. 4.2 kiloyear event, as it's sometimes called, is a label slapped on a cluster of signs. Oxygen isotopes in stalagmites, grain size in sediment cores, the chemistry of sea mud, pollen records moored showing more steppe and fewer trees. The signal isn't identical everywhere, and not all scholars agree on its timing or severity in every region. But taken together, it suggests that many of the zones feeding the early states of Mesopotamia, Syria, and beyond entered a period of prolonged aridity and climatic instability. Now, drought, by itself, is just less water. What turns it into a civilizational problem is everything humans have layered on top of the rain. Imagine a system like the Akkadian Empire in a run of bad years. First, the obvious part. Crops fail. Not everywhere at once, and not completely. Yields drop. Barley fields that used to give 3-4 times the seed now barely double it. Pasture grasses dry up earlier in the season. Herds have to be moved more often to poorer grazing. The empire's solution to almost everything is taxation. Grain, wool, labour, whatever can be counted and redirected. In good years, that flow of resources knits the empire together. In bad years, demands from the centre hit communities that were already struggling just to feed themselves. If you're a farmer on the edge of the dry farming zone in the north and the rains don't come, you still owe the same quotas on paper. Scribe doesn't have a draught column to write in. Soldiers still need rations. Temple dependents still need barley. Kings building projects still expect their brickmakers. So you cut deeper. You give up seed grain you were saving for next year. You sell children or relatives into debt service. You abandon marginal plots and fall back on the best soils. Meanwhile, people in even harsher spots are doing something more drastic. They move. One of the clearest archaeological hints of this period in northern Mesopotamia is the abandonment of dozens of small rural sites and the swelling of few walled towns. It looks like people, pressed by failing harvests, pulled back from the countryside and crowded into places that still had wells, food stores, walls. To officials in the south, that might look like opportunity. More labour to tax, more recruits. To people already living day to day on ration lists, it looks like competition and tension. Drought doesn't just lower water levels, pushes people into each other. As harvests shrink, storage reserves get drawn down. As reserves thin, any disruption bites deeper. Pest outbreak in the one remaining productive region. A flood that, once, comes as a curse instead of a blessing, washing away desperate replantings. A local governor padding his numbers to look good at court, extracting too much from a district that can't afford it. Resentment builds. Some communities start resisting tax collectors, holding back grain, slipping away to marginal lands rather than staying on imperial registers. Others may welcome outside powers who promise lighter burdens, or simply cannot be resisted. Because while the interior dries and strains, groups on the fringes, especially those more flexible, more mobile, can find advantage. In the texts we see names like Gutians, people from the Zagros Mountains to the east, moving into the story, just as Central Akkadian power falters. The tablets cast them as barbarians, destroyers of order. In reality, they may represent a mix of highland groups seizing a moment when the lowland machine is sputtering, to a palace scribe watching tax lists crumble and outlying cities fall away. This feels like invasion, like the end, to the people switching allegiance to a new overlord who demands less grain. It may feel more like a change in who you bow to on festival days, and all the while, the climate signal pulses in the background. Dry years, failed floods, salinizing fields in the south, where centuries of irrigation have left white crusts in the soil. Problems that a less centralized, less ambitious system might have flexed around become, under imperial management, multiplied. This is the cascade. Drought depresses yields. Fixed tax demands turn shortfalls into crisis. Crisis drives migration. Migration stresses receiving communities. Stressed communities revolt or invite external powers. External powers exploit the weakness. The imperial web that once moved food and soldiers across the landscape tiers. What rises from the tier is not nothing. After the Akkadian period, we see new constellations of power. City-states like Ur in the south, entering what we call the Ur III period, their own experiments in central planning. Amorite dynasties to the west and north, building kingdoms that balance irrigation agriculture with herding. Local rulers who seem more anchored in specific regions than in a single overarching empire. You can read this as decline, a fall from Sargon's 4 quarters. You can also read it as adaptation, a shift toward political forms that fit a drier, more unpredictable world, power centres spread out rather than tightly bound to one imperial core. Pattern that flickers through the Akkadian story is one we'll see again. As societies grow more complex, more specialised, more integrated, more dependent on long, precise chains of supply and command. They can buffer small shocks remarkably well. A single bad harvest here, a local flood there, are averaged out across the system. But when the shock is wide enough in space, and long enough in time, when rain patterns shift whole regions for decades, the very structures that once gave resilience can turn into channels that focus stress. Tax systems that kept granaries full now strip communities bare. Roads that once carried aid now carry invaders. Administrative routines that worked in normal years become traps when normality disappears. It's not that drought causes collapse in a simple way. Politics, wars, internal inequalities, choices made by rulers and villagers all matter. Climate is part of a web, not a single puppet master. Yet, again and again, from a card onward, we see how an environmental nudge, when it encounters a tightly wound, highly optimized system, can produce something that feels, from the inside, like the end of a world. And once you see that, it's hard not to look at other great cities of the same broad age. The quiet brick grids along the Indus, for example, and wonder how they handled their own encounters with water that did not behave. If you sail east in your imagination from the lands of Akkad, over mountains and deserts, and another great river plain, you arrive at a very different kind of experiment in urban life. Along the Indus and its tributaries, from what is now Pakistan deep into northwestern India, something curious appears in the archaeological record around 4,600 years ago. Cities, but not like the ones in Mesopotamia. Instead of ziggurats and royal victory stelas, you get brick grids that look almost modest, streets laid on straight lines, often at right angles, with major avenues running north-south and east-west. Neighbourhoods organised into blocks, drains running under the streets, linked to household bathing platforms, carefully graded so water would actually flow, in some of the largest sites, places we call Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. You see this almost obsessive attention to infrastructure. Wells sunk everywhere, sometimes one for every few houses. Covered sewers, standardized baked bricks, the same length-to-width ratio, turning up across hundreds of kilometres. Host. If you pick up a cubical stone weight from one Indus city and carry it to another, you can stack it on a local set and it will fit almost perfectly into the graded series. The script on their tiny seals, still undeciphered, shows similar signs from site to site. Pottery style types, faience manufacturing techniques repeat with small variations over a vast area. No known kings shouting their names from carved rock faces. No huge palaces towering over the common houses. Hierarchy existed. And it almost certainly did. It wasn't advertised in the same way. Instead, what you see over and over is planning, water management, standardization, quiet coordination. And this system doesn't just sit in isolation. Indus seals show up in Mesopotamian cities. Mesopotamian texts talk about a place across the sea called Meluha that supplied carnelian, timber, luxury woods, perhaps peacocks and exotic dogs. Coastal sites along the Arabian Sea, you find evidence of harbours, warehouses, shell-working industries feeding into wider networks. From roughly 2600 to 1900 BCE, the Indus world looks like one of the great urban networks of the Bronze Age, dozens of large towns and several major cities, linked by trade routes that moved raw materials, finished goods, probably ideas across thousands of kilometres. And then, slowly, it thins. With Akkad, the story, at least in later memory, curses and invasion. A dramatic fall from empire. With the Indus cities, there is no single sack burned into the ground, clear destruction layer tying everything together. Instead, we watch an urban fabric unravel thread by thread. Part of the story seems to be written in water again, but in a different register. The Indus system depends on monsoon rains, feeding rivers that wander across the plain. Those rivers are not fixed things. They shift channels, split, rejoin, abandon old beds. Geological and climate studies suggest that, over the course of the 3rd and early 2nd millennium BCE, some of the major rivers feeding Indus cities changed behaviour. The monsoon today dumps much of its rain on the northeastern part of the subcontinent, may have weakened and shifted, and some regions grew drier, perhaps saw rainfall patterns become more erratic. One proposed contributor is the gradual loss of a once mighty river system, the Ganga-Hakra, sometimes linked to the Sarasvati of later Indian texts, that seems to have dwindled from a glacially fed, year-round river into more seasonal or intermittent flows. Many early Indus sites sit along its course. As the water abandoned them, people may have had to follow the moisture elsewhere. At the same time, long-distance trade routes were not static either. Sea levels, coastal shapes, fortunes of foreign partners all changed. If Mesopotamian demand for Indus goods fell, or if routes through intermediary Gulf ports shifted, the economic logic of supporting big specialized cities far inland might have weakened. From about 1900 BCE onward, big brick grids start to show signs of strain. In some cities, the neat street plans get muddled. Houses are rebuilt over drains, streets are narrowed. Public works, kilns, wells, drains, are repaired less carefully or allowed to silt up. In others, key quarters are abandoned, while small peripheral settlements persist. Across the region, the use of standardized weights and measures declines. The distinctive script appears less frequently and then disappears. Baked brick gives way in many places to simpler mud construction. Population doesn't vanish altogether. In fact, in some areas, the number of small rural sites seems to increase just as the bigger cities empty out. People are still there. They're just distributed differently. More villages, fewer megasites. This is what some archaeologists mean when they talk about de-urbanization. Not an overnight catastrophe where everyone dies, but a long, uneven process of stepping back from dense, infrastructure-heavy city life towards smaller, more flexible communities. You can imagine reasons this might be a rational choice. River courses are fickle. Tying your fate to massive fixed walls and carefully laid sewer lines is a gamble. Monsoon rains dance from decade to decade, being closer to more varied fields. Able to move a little as conditions change has appeal. Overseas trade falters. A workshop churning out standardized beads for distant markets may be less useful than a homestead that does a bit of everything. That doesn't mean the transition was gentle. Archaeology is very good at some kinds of evidence and almost silent on others. Fire, collapse, defensive walls, mass graves. These leave crisp signatures, a slow grind of malnutrition, periodic famines, families slipping away in small groups, leaving behind a few broken pots and a filled-in well. That's harder to see. We do find skeletons in some Indus sites with signs of injury, disease, or stress. We see changes in diet, perhaps a shift toward less varied or lower status foods in some regions. We see migration patterns in the way pottery styles and settlement locations change. But we lack the clear, dramatic markers of large-scale slaughter or spectacular conquest that you get in some other ancient collapses. The Aryan invasion story that used to be told in older textbooks, horse-riding outsiders sweeping in and destroying the cities, is not supported by the kind of clean archaeological break that narrative would predict. Instead, what we see is a mosaic. Local declines and partial recoveries, people moving eastward into the Ganges plain, elements of Indus material culture persisting and blending into what comes after. From the inside, this could still have felt like the end of a world. If your grandparents had lived in a brick house on an orderly street with flowing water and ported ornaments, and you were born in a smaller village, scratching at more uncertain fields, the change would be real. From a distance of 4,000 years, it looks less like a wipeout and more like a reconfiguration. A great urban network, standardized and coordinated, gradually loosens. Nodes dim. New nodes appear elsewhere. Scripts vanish, but oral traditions continue. Brick gives way to mud, but people still plant, harvest, marry, tell stories. In the language of this episode, the Indus world reminds us that not every civilization ends in a single cinematic moment of destruction. Some bleed into their surroundings, their institutions dissolving, their people redistributing, until what made them visibly distinct can no longer be seen in the same way. Khad shows us how drought can tear an empire's web. The Indus shows us something subtler, how water that shifts, rain that hesitates, trade that falters can make dense urban life less attractive. Until the safest path is not to stand and fight for the city, but to quietly walk away. Civilizations, in other words, don't always die. Sometimes they just exhale, spread out, become part of the background from which new experiments will rise. And in the centuries after the Indus cities emptied their streets, other experiments were already taking shape around the eastern Mediterranean, tightly linked Bronze Age kingdoms that would discover, in their turn, what happens when interdependence becomes its own kind of vulnerability. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, if you drift your attention westward to the eastern Mediterranean, you find a different kind of web taking shape. Here, civilization looks less like one vast standardized system, and more like a crowded neighborhood of powerful neighbors who all know each other's names. On the great alluvial plain of the Nile, New Kingdom pharaohs carve their images into stone in exaggerated poses of triumph. In Anatolia, the Hittite kings rule from highland capitals, issuing clay tablet treaties with long, lawyerly preambles. To the east, Kassite Babylonia and Assyria watch and maneuver. On the Levantine coast, smaller kingdoms and wealthy port cities make their living as middlemen, shuttling goods up and down the shore. To the west, across the sea, the Mycenaean palaces of Greece are busy hoarding bronze, perfumed oil, captured slaves. It is a late Bronze Age globalized world in miniature. Ships move timber from Lebanon to Egypt, copper from Cyprus to everywhere, glass and luxury goods in all directions. Letters travel too, pressed into clay in cuneiform, sealed and sent from one king to another. We have some of them. The Amarna letters from an Egyptian archive, full of formal greetings and very human complaints. A great king writes to another, asking where his promised gold shipment has gone. A prince begs for troops to suppress a revolt. A queen mother negotiates a marriage alliance, complete with dowry lists. They call each other brother, send each other royal daughters, swap statues of gods, so that treaties can be sworn in the presence of the same, divine witnesses. Underneath this high diplomacy is a whole lattice of specialists, scribes trained to handle foreign languages and diplomatic formulas, caravan leaders and ship captains who know the safe harbours and the seasons, metal workers who can turn raw copper and scarce tin into the bronze weapons and tools on which elite power depends. The system is complex, and in its own way beautifully efficient. Egypt doesn't have much tin, but it has grain and gold. Anatolia has silver and horses. Cyprus has copper. Levantine ports have ships and harbours. Each piece slots into the others, but like any tightly coupled system, it has a hidden property. When one node fails, the shock doesn't stay local. Between about 1200 and 1150 BCE, the web trembles. Archaeologists and historians have argued about this collapse for generations, and no single cause has won the argument. Proud. What emerges instead is a mosaic of stressors, hitting different places in different ways, but overlapping just enough to matter. Pollen, cores and sediment records from the eastern Mediterranean suggest a period of drier, more variable conditions around this time. What some call a late Bronze Age drought episode. In texts from Ugarit and Hatti, we find letters that sound almost panicked. Kings pleading for grain, officials reporting failed harvests, envoys noting that we are dying of hunger. Prove. There are earthquakes. The Aegean and Anatolia sit on complicated fault systems. Cluster of sites show what some researchers interpret as earthquake destruction. Layers. Walls collapsed in consistent patterns. Buildings toppled without clear signs of burning or warfare. A city already strained by food shortages or political conflict is not well placed to absorb a major quake. There are internal revolts. In Egypt, texts from the reign of Ramesses III mention workmen at Deir el-Medina going on strike because their rations have not been delivered. In other places, burned palace complexes and hurriedly built fortifications inside cities hint that not all threats were foreign. When wages fail, when grain shipments lag, elites may face anger from below, as well as pressure from abroad. And there is war. A lot of it. One of the most dramatic faces of this violence appears in Egyptian reliefs and inscriptions about mysterious outsiders the scribes call the Sea Peoples. In the traditional story, these are waves of invading pirates from somewhere in the Aegean or beyond, sweep through the eastern Mediterranean, burning cities and toppling kingdoms. The reality that emerges from more cautious study is messier. Some of the Sea Peoples seem to be displaced groups, perhaps pushed from their homelands by the same mix of climate stress, warfare, social unrest that is troubling everyone else. Some may be hired mercenaries who turn to raiding when pay dries up. Egypt fights them on land and sea and boasts of victory. But even in triumph, Ramesses III describes them bringing their wives and their children, not just raiding parties, but migrating populations. Whether we imagine them as invaders, refugees, or something in between, they are part of a broader pattern. Large-scale movements of people, armed and desperate, colliding with already free, fragile states. Inside this storm, you can watch the supply chains start to snap. Bronze is an alloy. To make it, you need copper and tin. Copper is relatively common. Tin is not. Main known Bronze Age sources for tin were scattered. Central Anatolia, parts of Central Asia, possibly regions farther afield, wherever exactly it came from, it had to move long distances through multiple intermediaries to reach the foundries of Egypt, the Levant, and Greece. This means that palaces and armies, chariots and tools all depend on fragile corridors of peace and predictable shipping. Now, imagine a few links in that chain going bad at once. A border region racked by war where caravans used to pass. A port city burned, its warehouses and shipyards gone. A stretch of coast that becomes pirate. Haunted enough that merchants simply stay away. Season of failed harvests that drives states to seize cargoes intended for export, or makes ship owners unwilling to risk their crews. You don't have to shut down tin entirely to cause trouble. Even a modest reduction can force choices. Bronze spearheads for the army, bronze ploughshares for the farmers, weapons for the palace guard, or tools for the artisans who maintain the palace itself. The late Bronze Age world is full of palaces that seem to have chosen war first. As turmoil spreads, we see destruction layers in many of the great centres. Mycenaean palaces burned and abandoned, Hittite Hattusa sacked, coastal cities like Ugarit going dark. Archives are baked accidentally in the fires that destroy them, their last letters frozen mid-crisis. In some regions, writing disappears along with the palaces that house the scribes. In Greece, the Linear B script used to keep palace inventories, and ritual lists vanishes with the Mycenaean centres. Will be centuries before a new writing system, borrowed from the Phoenicians, appears. In parts of Anatolia and the Levant, literacy shrinks to a few enclaves, or flickers out for a while. But not everyone falls the same way. Egypt, bruised but unbroken, staggers on into what we call the Third Intermediate Period. Poorer, more fragmented, but still recognisably a state. In the highlands that will later be home to the Kingdom of Israel, small villages proliferate just as some coastal elites disappear. In the central Mediterranean, new groups. Phoenician merchants, early Italian communities, begin to grow into spaces left open by the collapse of older powers. Some places lose palaces and bureaucracies and never quite rebuild them in the same style. Others adapt, rewire, eventually thrive in the post-collapse landscape. From far away, the whole episode can look like a neat label on a timeline. Late Bronze Age collapse. From closer in, it feels more like a cascade. Drought thins the harvests. Earthquakes crack the walls. Supply convoys fail to arrive. Palace treasuries run dry, trying to pay soldiers and buy grain. Angry subjects revolt. Neighbours take advantage. Refugees, some of them armed, arrive at the gates. Each stressor amplifies the others. The important thing is not that there was a single killer, drought, or sea peoples, or earthquakes, but that in a tightly knotted system, you don't need a single killer. You just need enough overlapping shocks to push it past the point where it can self-correct. That feels uncomfortably familiar. You're not alone. We live in a world that is in some ways a far more extreme version of the late Bronze Age web. Global shipping routes instead of cedar boats, financial flows instead of copper ingots, data cables instead of clay tablets. Food grown on one continent, processed on another, consumed on a third. We have seen in our own time how a problem in one port or one banking system or one supply chain can ripple outward. A blocked canal, a pandemic, financial crisis. Each can reveal hidden dependencies we didn't notice when everything was humming along. The late Bronze Age reminds us that complexity brings both resilience and vulnerability. It allows specialization, beauty, and efficiency on a scale simple societies can't match. But it also means that when the shocks do come, they rarely arrive alone. They rarely stay put. For the kings who wrote those last anxious letters, the collapse of their world may have felt like an inexplicable punishment or the wrath of gods. From our perspective, drifting through history in the dark. It looks a little more like physics, a tightly coupled system pushed past its limits, one domino nudging the next, and until a whole pattern of life that had seemed solid for centuries lay scattered on the floor beyond that fallen pattern in the quieter centuries that followed. Other experiments were already beginning, new alphabets, new city-states, new empires that would add their own chapters to the long story of how civilizations rise, and how they learn again and again how easy it is to fall. If the Bronze Age collapse feels like a slow-motion disaster, spread over decades and whole regions, Vesuvius is the opposite. It is what happens when catastrophe hits on the scale of minutes and hours. In the year 79 of our era, people of Pompeii and Herculaneum are not living on the fragile edge of subsistence. They live in a Roman world of paved streets, bathhouses, painted walls and written notices. They have lawyers, taverns, bakeries, brothels, villas with imported marble, graffiti about politics and gladiator matches. They live under an empire that stretches from Britain to Egypt, stitched together by roads, taxes, soldiers and law. And above them, looming but mostly ignored, is a mountain that everyone calls a mountain, almost no one seems to recognise as a volcano. Vesuvius had erupted before, long before Roman memory. In the 1st century, it is green, terraced, planted with vines. Wealthy Romans own country houses there because the soil is rich and the view is beautiful. Danger is invisible until the day it isn't. Volcanic eruptions are not one thing. They are a sequence of different hazards, each with its own tempo. First comes the ashfall. When magma rich in gas reaches the surface and shatters, it throws a column of ash and pumice miles into the sky. The wind takes it. Over Pompeii it begins as a curious rain of white pumice stones start to sag. People try to sweep the weight away. As the eruption continues, darker ash falls, choking the air, turning day into twilight. Anyone who has to choose between sheltering in buildings that may collapse or going out into an atmosphere full of needles of glass. Ashfall is slow enough that some people escape. It is also relentless enough that those who misjudge the timeline can be trapped. Then there are the pyroclastic flows. These are not flows in the gentle sense. They are avalanches of hot gas, ash, broken rock that surge down the slopes at highway speeds, or faster. At temperatures high enough to char wood and kill within seconds, they hug the ground, follow valleys, pour over walls and through streets. A pyroclastic flow doesn't burn you like a campfire, overwhelms you like being hit by a collapsing building made of scorching fog. Herculaneum, closer to the volcano on the other side of the mountain, hit by these flows earlier. Ash and superheated gases pour into boathouses where people have taken shelter. Pompeii, further away and downwind of the ash column, endures hours of pumice, fall before the column partially collapses, and flows reach the city. Mixed into all this are other hazards. Lahars, volcanic mudflow, can come later when ash on the slopes mixes with rain, turning into rivers of concrete that bury towns downstream. Toxic gases, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, can pool in low-lying areas, invisible, displacing breathable air. People and animals can suffocate without understanding why. A single large eruption stacks these dangers. Initial blast, ashfall, pyroclastic surges, later mudflows. Each one reshapes the landscape, crushes buildings, clogs rivers, poisons fields. For Pompeii and Herculaneum, the result is total local annihilation. But local matters. The Roman Empire does not fall when Vesuvius erupts. Trade routes bypass the damaged bay. Refugees are absorbed into other towns. Senators complain about lost villas. Emperors allocate relief. Tax flows adjust. In a world where grain from North Africa feeds Rome, the destruction of a handful of coastal cities is a tragedy, terminal event. This is the scale lesson volcanoes teach. You can erase a city in an afternoon and barely dent a civilization. And yet for us, Pompeii and Herculaneum loom larger than entire vanished kingdoms. That's because they became something else. Time capsules. The same ash and flows that killed their inhabitants also sealed their world. Walls, furniture, painted scenes of gods and lovers, election slogans, bread loaves still in ovens. All frozen at the moment of interruption. When those layers were finally dug into again, almost 2 millennia later, they offered an intimacy of detail we rarely get from the past. We see not just temples and fortifications, but shopping lists, jokes, the way a child's bed was placed in the corner of a room. Disasters do this sometimes. They create accidental archives, buried under volcanic deposits, flooded and silted over, burned and then entombed in collapse. Moments of everyday life that would normally decay are suddenly preserved. For archaeologists, these are gold mines of information. People who lived through them, they were endings. In a strange way, this preservation distorts our sense of history. Pompeii feels like one of the best-known cities of the ancient world, not because it was uniquely important, because its death was archaeologically kind. There were countless other towns, in countless other cultures, that ended less dramatically, or were later quarried away, or lie under modern cities we haven't dug up. Their stories feel thinner, not because their lives were less rich, because their endings did not freeze them for us. Vesuvius is not unique as a threat either, only as a storyteller. Other eruptions have done more than erase single towns. Some have nudged climate itself, host. When a volcano sends ash and sulfur-rich gases high into the stratosphere, they can spread around the globe, forming fine aerosol layers that reflect sunlight. For a year or two, the planet cools slightly. Harvests fail in places that never saw a single ash flake. The 1815 eruption of Tambora in Indonesia is one later example, produced the year without a summer. In parts of Europe and North America, crop failures, famines and strange cold, earlier eruptions. Like the massive Thera eruption in the Bronze Age Aegean, or Icelandic events that darkened medieval skies, have been linked, cautiously, to social stress and political upheaval. Again the pattern repeats. Local destruction, plus wider, softer ripples through climate and agriculture. Most of the time, even big eruptions don't end civilizations outright. They punch holes in them, they stress food systems, trigger famines, push migrating groups across borders, weaken states already dealing with other problems. A city vanishes here, a kingdom falters there. Only in the most extreme cases, super-eruptions like Toba in deep prehistory, hypothetical Yellowstone-scale events in the future. Pompeii sits comfortably below that level. Its loss is devastating in human terms, negligible in imperial terms, priceless in archaeological terms. When we think about worlds ending, it is worth keeping this layered view in mind. There are personal worlds, erased in an afternoon when a pyroclastic surge turns a familiar street into a grave. There are city worlds, frozen under ash and rediscovered as museums. And there are civilizational worlds which are far harder to kill. They take repeated blows, overlapping shocks, and time. Vesuvius reminds us how fast the small scale can vanish, and how stubborn the larger systems can be. False. It also reminds us that our view of the past is shaped again and again by where disaster chose to fall and what it chose to bury. Volcanoes show us what destruction looks like when it is loud, bright, and obvious. Plagues are the opposite. There is no towering column of ash, no molten rock. Just a cough in a crowded street, a fever in a farmhouse, a ship that docks one evening with a few too many rats in the hold. And yet, over a few terrible years in the mid-14th century, something every bit as world-bending as Vesuvius moved across Europe. Quietly, we call it the Black Death. Between about 1347 and 1353, waves of disease spread from the eastern Mediterranean through Italy, France, Iberia, England, the German lands, Scandinavia, and beyond. Chroniclers talk about towns where half the people died or more. Modern estimates vary. Many historians think Europe may historians a third to a half of its population in that brief window. This is not annihilation in the sense of cities turned to stone. It is annihilation measured in missing faces, empty beds, silent workshops, fields where the plough teams never went out that spring. For a long time, the Black Death was described very simply: pandemic of bubonic plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas on black rats moving along trade routes. That story is still powerful, and there is good evidence for it. DNA of the bacterium has been found in medieval skeletons. Descriptions of swellings in the groin and armpits match buboes. But even here, certainty frays at the edges. Some outbreaks move too fast, patterns that look more like person-to-person respiratory spread than the slow crawl of flea-ridden rodents. Climate reconstructions suggest that rodent populations in Central Asia may have surged and crashed in response to shifting rains, creating pulses of infected animals that spilled over into human caravan routes long before anyone in Europe noticed a thing. There may have been multiple transmission modes at once: fleas, human lice, droplets in the air. Pandemics are ecological events. Post. They live in the space where animal reservoirs, human habits, climate, trade, and chance all intersect. They also have their own rhythm. First sweep of the Black Death was brutal. Then, like a fire running out of fuel, it faded. But the pathogen did not vanish. It smouldered. For centuries afterward, local and regional plagues flared up again and again. London in the 1660s, Marseille in the 1720s. Each one a reminder that the system had never fully returned to its old balance. What makes the 14th century pandemic so important for our story is not only how many died, but what the survivors had to do to keep going. Vesuvius teaches the difference between local destruction and imperial survival. Black Death shows how a civilization can be transformed from the inside without ever technically falling. With so many people gone, labour became scarce. In much of Western Europe, especially in England and parts of France and the Low Countries, this scarcity pushed wages up. Fields lay fallow because there were not enough hands. Landlords found it harder to keep peasants tied to the soil. In some places, workers bargained for better terms, more freedom, a share of their own production. Urban artisans could demand higher pay. Ruling elites did not accept this quietly. In England, the Crown tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels with the Ordinance and Statute of Labourers. Similar attempts to regulate pay and movement appeared elsewhere. The result was tension, sometimes open revolt. The English peasants' revolt of 1381 being one famous example. Plague had loosened the social knots that held the old order in place. No law could pull them quite as tight again. At the same time, not everyone shared in these gains. In many towns, fear and confusion turned outward. Minority communities, especially Jews, were accused of poisoning wells or conspiring to spread disease. Pogroms and expulsions followed, particularly in parts of the German-speaking lands and Spain. Here, the Black Death was not a pathway to bargaining power, pretext for persecution and loss. Even the economic story was uneven. Some regions, such as parts of Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean, saw more complex patterns. In some areas, labour became cheaper again as migration reshuffled populations. In others, large estates hardened their control, shifting towards systems that look, in retrospect, more like serfdom than freedom. The same disease, moving through different legal and social structures, produced different futures. It also nudged institutions. With so many clergy dead, the church had to recruit quickly, sometimes relaxing educational standards, changed the character of religious life in ways that are still debated. Urban governments experimented with new forms of health regulation, quarantine stations, pest houses, rules about ship arrivals. The word quarantine itself comes from the 40 days ships might be required to wait before unloading. But they represent the first systematic public health responses in European records, practical experiments in managing invisible threats. When historians talk about the Black Death rewiring Europe, this is what they mean. Landholding patterns shifted. Feudal obligations weakened in some places and hardened in others. Town councils gained authority as they coordinated responses. Tax structures changed as states tried to cope with shrinking revenues and military needs that did not shrink. Cultural attitudes toward death, fate, and the body grew darker in some art, more introspective in some literature, tempting to draw a straight line. Plague leads to labour freedom, which leads to capitalism, which leads to the modern world. Straight lines are comforting illusions. The pandemic was one force among many, interacting with wars, climate shifts, technological changes, religious movements. In some contexts, it opened doors, in others, it slammed them shut. What we can say is that after the Black Death, Europe was operating under a different set of constraints and possibilities than before. Civilizations do not have to crumble into ruins to be transformed. Sometimes they pass through a kind of fever, lose a large fraction of their people, just their institutions and expectations, and continue on in a new shape. Plagues remind us that not all world-changing powers march in armour or erupt from mountains. Some of the deepest resets in history have been driven by entities too small to see, riding unnoticed in the fur of a rat or the breath of a stranger. When we talk about worlds before ours, we think of lost cities and sunken coasts. But many of the shifts that prepare the way for new worlds are invisible while they happen. Visible only later in the altered patterns of who works, who rules, who is welcome, and who is blamed. The Black Death did not erase European civilization. It bent it, and it leaves us with an uneasy thought, that under the surface of any busy, confident society, there can always be a quiet contagion, already moving, or already testing how much of that world can be rewired without breaking. If the Black Death was a storm that passed through a familiar landscape, the epidemics that followed European contact in the Americas were something more like an alien sky, opening over an entire hemisphere. 1492 was not just ships and swords and flags, it was microbes. When people talk about the Columbian Exchange, they often mean foods and ideas, maize and potatoes, crossing the Atlantic, horses and wheat going the other way. New religions, new languages, new technologies. The deepest exchange was biological, and it ran mostly in one direction. From Europe, Africa and Asia came smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, whooping cough. Diseases that had circulated for centuries in the Old World, burning through dense populations again and again, killing many, but also leaving survivors with partial immunity that could be passed on genetically and culturally. In the Americas, pathogens met populations that had been largely isolated for more than 10,000 years. Immunological isolation is a strange sort of peace. Countless generations, indigenous societies had faced their own diseases, their own parasites and pathogens, but they'd not been part of the huge disease pool created by millennia of Afro-Eurasian cities, livestock herds, caravan routes, and crowded ports. That meant no lingering background immunity to smallpox or measles. No long record of repeated childhood infections that most survived. Some did not. When the Old World viruses arrived, they were not familiar visitors. They were invaders in a landscape with almost no prior defences. Under those conditions, the same disease behaves very differently. Smallpox in 17th century London might kill a fraction and leave the rest scarred but alive. In many indigenous communities, it tore through like a fire in dry grass. Some estimates suggest that in certain regions, the first waves of disease after contact may have killed half the population or more within a few decades. In some places, repeated epidemics over generations pushed the losses higher still. But even those numbers don't quite capture what was happening, because disease rarely travelled alone. It arrived on the breath of strangers, who were also soldiers, colonists, slavers, missionaries, traders. Epidemics intersected with war, forced labour, famine, and displacement in a vicious feedback loop. Village devastated by smallpox can't plant all its fields. Harvests fail. Hunger weakens the survivors, making the next disease wave deadlier. Colonial authorities, seeing empty land, move settlers in or press the remaining people into labour in mines, fields or missions. Work and malnutrition further erode resistance. Warfare, whether open conquest, slave raiding, desperate resistance, pushes refugees into new territories, carrying pathogens with them or crowding them into camps where infection thrives. From the outside, later observers sometimes saw only declining native populations and assumed this was an almost natural withering. Up close, it was more like a series of hammer blows, each one making the next more destructive. And yet the pattern was not one single story played out everywhere at once. The Americas before contact were not a single civilization, thousands of societies, from dense imperial centres to small mobile bands, from the Andes to the Arctic. Their encounters with epidemic disease followed different timelines, moved along different routes, and produced different outcomes. In central Mexico, dense populations, tribute systems, and imperial roads created ideal conditions for contagion. The first great smallpox epidemic documented there in the early 1520s struck at the same time as Spanish military campaigns against the Aztec Triple Alliance. Chroniclers speak of rulers dying, armies unable to field fighters, cities paralysed by fear and grief. Here, disease and conquest reinforced each other. Weakened defenders, disoriented leadership, invaders who had already survived childhood infections. Far to the north, among many indigenous nations in what is now Canada and the United States, large-scale epidemics seemed to appear later, sometimes racing ahead of substantial European settlement. Carried by trade networks and occasional contacts, communities could be struck by a sickness whose origin they had never seen, brought by people who themselves might not yet have met a colonist face to face. In the Andes, the Inca Empire was shaken by what was likely smallpox in the 1520s, before Pizarro's main force arrived. The disease may have killed the Sapa Inca and his heir, helping trigger a civil war that fractured imperial authority. By the time Spanish soldiers reached the highland cities, they were walking into a political landscape already destabilized by a pathogen no one understood. Other regions, especially more remote or dispersed populations, sometimes managed to avoid the earliest waves, only to be struck later. Trade and missionary routes extended deeper into the interior. For some Amazonian groups, major epidemics did not come until the rubber boom centuries after Columbus. Different timelines, different combinations of disease, violence, disruption, but a recurring pattern of loss. In this sense, what happened in the Americas pushes us to widen what we mean by a wipeout. Temples, languages, and agricultural terraces did not all vanish overnight. Maize still grew, pottery was still shaped, stories were still told. In many areas, indigenous cultures endured, adapted, hid certain practices behind new forms, blended elements of old and new worlds into something that colonizers often barely understood. But when a continent loses a vast fraction of its people, fathers and mothers, farmers and artisans, healers and navigators, the web of relationships that held its civilizations together is torn. Political systems that had depended on dense populations of labourers and warriors could not operate as before. Ritual cycles broke when key lineages were cut short. Knowledge encoded in memories, not yet written down in European alphabets, sometimes disappeared with the last elders who carried it. The result was not a clean erasure, but a forced reconfiguration under relentless pressure. And yet, even under those pressures, there was survival. Indigenous communities learned, as other societies had before them, to navigate a new disease environment. Some developed their own forms of quarantine and care. Some shifted settlement patterns, dispersing or relocating. Many adopted or adapted new crops, tools and alliances, while holding on to core identities out of sight of colonial eyes. Languages that officials tried to suppress are still spoken today. Ceremonies once driven underground have been revived. Political movements led by indigenous peoples now invoke histories that, for centuries, were dismissed or ignored. Archaeology and oral tradition together reveal continuities that the statistics of demographic collapse can't fully show. From the perspective of our question, what wipes out a world? The post-contact Americas look like a civilization-scale catastrophe that did not end, ashes and silence, but with a transformed, wounded, yet enduring mosaic of peoples. Population can collapse without culture, entirely dying. World can be shattered numerically, and still persist as memory, language, and practice, carried forward by those who refused to vanish, which is its own kind of lesson. Because if the earlier plagues we've talked about rewired societies from within, the epidemics in the Americas show what happens when disease arrives as part of a larger system of conquest. When microbes, guns, hunger, move together. And they raise an unsettling thought that will follow us into the next turns of this story, that a world does not have to be extinguished to be fundamentally altered. Sometimes what is wiped out is not the existence of a people, but the particular shape their world once had, the density of their towns, the reach of their networks, the balance of power in their homelands. The civilization survives, but as something new, rebuilt in the long shadow of loss. After waves of disease, it's tempting to imagine that the real dangers to civilizations always arrive in obvious forms. Fevers, swords, invaders on the horizon. Sometimes the pressure comes from something so quiet you don't notice it at first. A few summers that seem a little shorter, a few winters that bite a little harder. A river that ices over more often than anyone remembers. One bad harvest that turns into 3. Historians call one of these long, uneasy shifts the Little Ice Age. It wasn't a single event, and it wasn't an ice age in the way we talk about mammoths and mile-high glaciers. From roughly the 1300s into the 1800s, large parts of the Northern Hemisphere went through a period of cooler, more unpredictable climate. Not a constant freeze, but a pattern of colder winters, shorter growing seasons, and sudden swings between years. On a thermometer, the change might look unimpressive. Degree cooler here, a few tenths there. To a wheat field growing at the edge of what's possible, that's the difference between ripening and rotting green in the rain, between bending heavy with grain and standing there, half-filled. When the frost comes early, and when harvests fail, the numbers start moving in other places. In 14th century Europe, first sharp turn came before the Black Death, with what we now call the Great Famine of 1315-1317. A run of cold, wet summers drenched the grain fields, spoiled hay for animals, and made it hard to dry and store what little food did grow. Chroniclers speak of people eating cats bark the flesh of executed criminals. In some cities, bread prices tripled or quadrupled. When you live close to the line, a price spike like that doesn't mean it's expensive. It means you don't eat. The climate didn't cause the famine all by itself. Feudal obligations, poor storage, and rigid markets all played their part, but the weather was the hand on the first domino. And once it tipped, everything else followed. The same pattern appears again and again in the centuries that followed. In the later 1500s and early 1600s, cooler conditions returned across much of Europe and parts of Asia. Historians sometimes talk about a general crisis of the 17th century. Wars, rebellions, state breakdowns from China to the Ottoman Empire to France. It's not that a drop in temperature marched armies across borders. Shorter growing seasons meant tighter grain supplies. Tighter grain supplies meant higher prices. Higher prices meant hungry soldiers, angry taxpayers, and rulers scrambling to extract more from populations already strained. In China, the late Ming dynasty struggled to cope with a series of droughts and frosts that devastated crops in the north. Grain prices rose. Banditry spread. Peasant uprisings grew. When Manchu forces pushed in from the northeast, they weren't walking into a stable empire. They were entering a landscape where climate stress had already weakened the political glue. In parts of northern Europe, especially where farmers were already working marginal land, repeated crop failures drove people to move. Some left the countryside for the cities, hoping for work and bread. Others packed up and sailed for the Americas, turning personal desperation into a wave of colonial migration. Cold can also sharpen conflict at the edges. On the Eurasian steppe and in high latitude zones, cooler, drier conditions damaged pastures. Herders whose animals were failing had to push into new territories, or press harder on existing neighbours. That pressure could ripple outward. Displaced groups collided with settled farmers or with other mobile peoples, sometimes turning local resource stress into regional wars. And yet, not every society under the same sky suffered equally. The Little Ice Age did not blanket the whole Earth in the same way. Some regions warmed while others cooled. Some saw harsher winters, but decent summers. Monsoon patterns shifted in complex ways. Even in places where the climate signal is clear, human responses varied wildly. Some states had grain reserves, granaries, filled in good years that could be opened in bad ones. Others allowed, or encouraged, long-distance trade that, when one region's harvest failed, ships or caravans could bring in food from a luckier zone. Some had relatively flexible institutions, able to cut taxes, forgive debts, or organise public works when times got hard. Those resilience factors, storage, trade, governance, and even diet, often mattered more than the exact number on the thermometer. Community that relies on a single staple, crop planted right at the edge of its viable range, is like someone living paycheck to paycheck. One missed payment, and everything tumbles. A community that eats a mix of grains, roots, legumes, and animal products, drawn from different microclimates, has more slack in the system. If the wheat fails, maybe the barley survives. If the river fish vanish, maybe the upland herds are doing well. In parts of Europe where bread was life, a bad grain harvest could bring a city to the brink in months. In some indigenous Arctic and subarctic societies, which had long traditions of food sharing, storage, and seasonal mobility, a harsh winter was dangerous, but not automatically catastrophic. Knowledge of where to find backup foods, social norms that obligated people to help kin and neighbours, could stretch scarce supplies much further. Modern scientists still debate the details of the Little Ice Age. How much of the cooling came from volcanic eruptions that dimmed the sun with ash? How much from changes in solar activity? How uniform was the cooling, really, across continents and centuries? Tree rings, ice cores, lake sediments, old diaries don't always point in exactly the same direction. Historians debate just as much. Did the harsher climate of the 17th century fundamentally drive the wars and revolutions of that era, or did it merely push along conflicts that would have happened for other reasons? Religion, dynastic politics, new gunpowder technologies. When we zoom in on any one region, the simple story of cold equals chaos starts to fray. What emerges instead is a pattern that feels very familiar by now. Climate stress acts less like a solitary executioner and more like a multiplier. It takes whatever tensions, injustices, and vulnerabilities already exist in a system and turns the dial up. A rigid tax regime becomes unbearable. Distant war becomes unsustainable. A small gap between haves and have-nots, widened by food prices, becomes a chasm across which riots burn. Worlds don't usually end just because the temperature drops a degree. They falter when that drop lands on societies already stretched thin, little in the way of buffers, solidarity, or imagination about how to change course. And each time we trace one of these climate turns, we edge closer to an even older question. What happens when the stress is not a few hard winters, but something much more extreme? Not cooler summers and frozen rivers, but ash-darkened skies, poisoned oceans, or rocks falling from space. When we talk about the Little Ice Age, or even the worst plagues in human history, we're still dealing with what geologists would call Local problems. Local in time, local in damage, even if they felt world, ending to the people living through them. Deep time has other kinds of endings. Imagine winding the clock back, not centuries, tens of millions of years at a time. Civilizations disappear, languages vanish. Entire species rise, spread, die out without a single name ever being attached to them. The continents slide slowly into different shapes. Seas open and close, once. Every so often, the record in the rocks shows something that looks less like a bad century and more like the planet slipping on the stairs, mass extinctions. On a graph of fossil diversity, most of Earth's history looks like a sawtooth pattern. Slow gains, occasional dips. Then, at a few sharp points, the line doesn't just wobble, it plunges, at the end. At the end of the Permian period, about 252 million years ago, something like 80 to 90% of marine species, and a huge share of land species, vanish in what's sometimes called the Great Dying. At the end of the Cretaceous, 66 million years ago, the non-avian dinosaurs and many of their neighbours disappear. Earlier, there are other spikes. The End, Ordovician, Late Devonian, End, Triassic. 5 big ones, maybe 6, depending on how you count. From far enough away, each of these looks like a reset button for the biosphere. But the button isn't pushed by a single finger. It's more like a whole hand of different processes closing at once. One of the quietest, but most powerful, is something called a large igneous province. The name sounds dry, but the reality would have been anything but. A large igneous province is what happens when the planet opens a vein. Instead of a single volcano here or there, you get vast regions where molten rocks up through the crust for hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of years, not always in explosive bursts. Floodverticutes, but in floodwar, like eruptions that spread lava across areas the size of countries or small continents. Siberian traps, which erupt around the time of the end. Permian extinction are one of the best known examples. The Deccan traps in India light up just as the dinosaurs are going through their final crisis. At first glance, you might think the problem is the lava itself. A lake of rock hundreds of meters deep is not a friendly neighbour. But for the global biosphere, the real damage comes from the atmosphere. As those vast volumes of magma force their way up, they cook the rocks they pass through, carbon-rich sediments, sulfur-bearing layers. Anything volatile gets heated, broken down, and released. Gigatons of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide spill into the air. CO2 builds up over time, trapping heat, acidifying oceans as it dissolves into seawater, shifting climate patterns. Sulfur dioxide works faster, turning into sulfatey aerosols high in the atmosphere that reflect sunlight back into space. Those aerosols can create what some researchers call volcanic winters. Years of dimmed sunlight, cooler surface temperatures, shorter growing seasons on land and in the sea. Now, scale that not to one bad eruption, but to repeated pulses over hundreds of thousands of years, bursts of aerosol winter, followed by swings into hothouse conditions as CO2 accumulates. Oceans struggling to hold oxygen as they warm and stratify. Coral reefs bleaching and dissolving. Food chains breaking near the bottom where plankton live. And the damage crawling upward to predators, species that depend on stable, oxygen-rich, well-lit seas start to die off in droves. On land, plants and animals adapted to narrow climate bands find those bands shifting out from under them. Forests die back, soils erode. Insects, fungi, opportunistic species move into the gaps. Then there are the more spectacular endings. Asteroid and comet impacts are, in some ways, simpler. Large rock moving very fast hits a planet. Energy has to go somewhere. For the Chicxulub impact at the end of the Cretaceous, the estimates are hard to grasp. An object, perhaps 10 kilometres across, moving at tens of kilometres per second, striking shallow ocean near what's now the Yucatan Peninsula. Shock waves, firestorms from re-entering ejecta, earthquakes, tsunamis, the energy release dwarfs our entire nuclear arsenal. But again, the immediate blast is only the opening act, rock. And sulfur-rich sediments are vaporized and thrown high into the atmosphere. Tiny droplets of molten material solidify into glassy spherules that spread around the globe. Dust and aerosols wrap the planet. For months, maybe years, sunlight is drastically reduced. Photosynthesis falters, temperatures plunge. This is another kind of global winter, an impact winter. How do we know any of this happened? In detail, tens of millions of years after the fact. Geologists read a kind of forensic record. At the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary, you find a thin layer of clay enriched in iridium, a metal rare in Earth's crust, but common in many meteorites. Find shocked quartz, grains whose crystal structure has been deformed in ways that only extreme pressures, like those from an impact, seem to create. You find tiny spherules and tektites, droplets of once molten rock that rained back down. Find a buried crater in Mexico that matches the age and scale of the event. For large igneous provinces, the evidence comes from the rocks themselves. Immense stacks of basalt, radiometric dates that line up with extinction intervals, chemical signatures in ocean sediments showing sudden changes in carbon isotopes, oxygen levels, and temperature. In both kinds of catastrophe, pattern repeats. Most species die, but not all. Extinctions are not a clean sweep. They're a sorting process, harsh but not random. Body size matters. Large animals with slow reproduction and big daily energy needs are fragile when food chains snap. Tiny creatures that can hunker down, wait, or switch diets have an edge. Diet matters. Specialist animals that eat only one kind of plant, live only in one narrow niche, are exquisitely vulnerable when that plant or niche disappears. Generalists that can scavenge, graze, browse across a range of foods, find ways to hang on. Geography matters. Species scattered across wide ranges, especially those that occupy many microhabitats, have more chances to find local refuges where conditions stay marginally tolerable. In the seas, organisms in shallow, warm, well-lit waters tend to be hardest hit by sudden changes in temperature and chemistry. Deep water communities, those that can tolerate low oxygen, sometimes ride out the chaos better. Even in the great dying at the end of the Permian, when it seems the planet itself is trying to shed life, a thin, stubborn thread of survivors makes it through, and it's from that thread that new ecosystems, new evolutionary experiments eventually bloom. All of this lava floods, impact winters, oceans turning sour, belongs to the story of the biosphere. The living skin of the planet restructured, sometimes brutally, tens of millions of years. Human civilization collapses are something else. When a city falls or an empire fragments, species Homo sapiens is usually not in existential danger. Population numbers might shrink in a region, technologies might be forgotten or abandoned, but the organisms, us, continue. We move, adapt, rebuild. A Roman grain warehouse becomes a medieval fort. Mayan temple is swallowed by jungle and then unearthed again. The rock record barely notices. A true biosphere collapse, the kind we see at mass extinction boundaries, is written into minerals and mud. Layers of sudden death, isotopic lurches that speak of chemistry gone wrong, entire ecological guilds erased. So when people wonder, in late-night conversations and speculative novels, whether there might have been earlier high-tech civilizations before us, 6 forgotten worlds that rose and fell long before our own, geologists ask a quiet follow-up question. What would they leave behind that could compete with a flood basalt, Chicxulub? If a technological species burned fossil fuels on a planetary scale, altered nitrogen cycles, manufactured complex synthetics, or mined metals in huge volumes, they would leave signals, not cities standing proud after hundreds of millions of years. That's far beyond the lifespan of most surface structures, but chemical fingerprints in sediments anomalous, spikes of certain isotopes, unusual distributions of metals, layers containing plastics or their degraded remnants, patterns of extinction that don't quite fit volcanism or impacts alone. In other words, they would show up in the same deep-time forensics we already use to reconstruct ancient cataclysms. So far, in the rocks we've read, we see the marks of supervolcanoes, asteroid strikes, shifting continents, and the slow work of evolution exploring and erasing forms. We don't, yet, see a smoking gun for an industrial civilization older than our own. That doesn't mean it's impossible in principle. It does mean that if there were earlier worlds of machines and cities, they either never reached global scale, or their traces lie buried in parts of the crust we haven't, or maybe can't, examine. And that brings us back, gently, to our own place in the story. We're not the first beings to live through climate swings, chemical shocks, or sudden losses of biodiversity. We may be the first to create those conditions for ourselves, knowingly, with the power to read the rocks beneath our feet and ask, if there were 6 civilizations before us, how would we know? And what exactly are we leaving for whoever reads the record next? People talk about they're really stacking several different kinds of stories on top of each other. One stack is mythic. In a lot of traditions, the world isn't made once. It's made, destroyed, and remade in cycles. The ancient Greeks talked about ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron. Hindu cosmology speaks of yugas, vast cycles of time in which humanity rises and declines. Mesoamerican myths describe previous suns, earlier creations that ended in flood, wind, or jaguars. These aren't archaeological reports. They're memory and metaphor, but they do tell us something important. People, looking back on ruins and disasters even thousands of years ago, already felt as if they were living in at least the second or third try. Another stack is archaeological. Here, worlds can mean big cultural packages that rise, spread, and vanish. The Neolithic farmers of the Fertile Crescent, first city-states in southern Mesopotamia. The Old Kingdom pyramid builders. The Indus Valley's gridded cities. The classic Maya, Bronze Age palace economies around the eastern Mediterranean. Each had its own way of organizing labor, storing knowledge, moving goods and ideas. Each, in some senses, counted as a civilization. If you want it, to pick out 6 that matter to you and say, we're living in the 7th. And then there's the deepest stack of all. Geological epochs. The Silurian, Devonian, Jurassic, Cretaceous. Bands of time that lasted tens of millions of years, each with its own typical climate, plants, and animals. Someone thinking in planetary terms might talk about 6 great worlds before ours, 6 very different Earths separated by mass extinctions and slow recoveries. So when you hear the phrase, "we are the seventh civilization," it could be pointing to mythic ages, to human cultural phases, or to entire biospheres. Only one of those, though, raises the unsettling late-night question: could there have been another technological species before us? This is where stories about Atlantis, Lemuria, or lost global empires come in. They often imagine a civilization much like ours: metalworks, ships, maybe even aircraft and energy grids, existing tens of thousands, or even millions of years ago, and then being wiped nearly clean by some catastrophe. Mainstream archaeology is skeptical for simple reasons. Human bones, tools, and genetics all tell a story in which large, complex societies appear quite late. The last 10,000 years, give or take. Before that, we see hunter-gatherers, then early farmers, slowly growing towns. There's no credible evidence of steel skyscrapers hidden inside 100,000-year-old rock, no industrial slag buried in Jurassic sediments. But geology forces us to admit something more subtle. The surface of the Earth is forgetful. That's the starting point for a thought experiment called the Silurian hypothesis. A couple of planetary scientists asked themselves, if an industrial civilization had existed, say, 100 million years ago, how would we know? They borrowed the name Silurian from an old science fiction story about ancient reptiles. But the point wasn't to insist those creatures were real, to test our assumptions. Their conclusion was uncomfortable in a quiet way. Over millions of years, almost everything obvious would be gone. Buildings collapse and are eroded. Roads weather away. Open pit mines fill, slump, and are overgrown. Even entire coastlines are eaten, grain by waves. Most of the ocean floor is younger than 200 million years, constantly created at mid-ocean ridges and swallowed back into the mantle at subduction zones. Continents, too, are ground down and recycled. Ice, wind, and running water chew at mountains. Sediments are buried, heated, squeezed, and transformed into new rocks. If you imagine New York City, Tokyo, or Lagos being left alone for 10 million years, then 20, then 50, you shouldn't picture a ghost metropolis under the jungle. You should picture a few distorted foundations, then a stained layer of rubble, then nothing you could see with the naked eye, just altered minerals in a buried slice of sediment. So if not skyscrapers, what would convince us? You'd want a combination of clues. Not a single odd artifact, but patterns. First, datable artifacts out of place in time. Metal alloys that don't occur naturally. Complex ceramic, or synthetic polymers found in rocks that can be reliably dated to, say, the Cretaceous. Not in one spot where contamination is possible, but in many locations, sealed within undisturbed layers. Second, industrial residues. Large-scale burning of fossil carbon leaves a mark in carbon isotopes. A sudden shift in the ratio of light to heavy carbon in marine and lake sediments, consistent with massive release of ancient organic carbon over a short geological interval. We're already creating such a spike now. Another technological species doing something similar would leave its own sharp wiggle in the isotopic record. You might also see odd distributions of metals. Mining and smelting concentrate elements like copper, lead, and rare earths far beyond their usual background levels. A civilization that built electronics or large grids might scatter unusual metal ratios across the globe, detectable millions of years later in the mud. Third, anomalous compounds, some synthetic, certain plastics, refrigerants, or industrial chemicals, don't occur in nature and break down very slowly under the conditions at the bottom of the sea. Traces of them, or of their characteristic breakdown products, could be trapped in ancient sediments as molecular fossils, after bottles and pipes themselves had crumbled. The Silurian hypothesis doesn't claim we've found any of this. We haven't. The mass extinctions and climate lurches we know about can be explained quite well by impacts, volcanism, and plate tectonics. Chemical stories in the rocks line up with those causes. What the hypothesis does is remind us of two things at once. First, search for other. Worlds like ours limited by the planet's own housekeeping. Much of the crust has been shredded and rewritten. Many potential signals will have been smeared, diluted, or irrelevant where we may never drill. Second, complexity, whether biological or cultural, is fragile. You don't need 6 earlier human-like civilizations to feel how precarious as is. Fossil record already shows how quickly rich ecosystems can be trimmed back when climate wind. When climate swings too fast, when chemistry tips out of balance, too many stresses arrive at once. The archaeological record shows how cities and states can falter under drought, plague, or political fracture, so we rest for now, in a space between certainty and imagination. We don't see solid evidence for industrial civilizations before us. We do see, written again and again in stone and mud, that worlds can end, not always with fire from the sky, but in slow, grinding ways that only look sudden when you compress the timeline. Whether we're the first of our kind or the 7th, the lesson is the same. Complicated systems, ecosystems, economies, networks of cities, take time to build and can be undone by forces they themselves set in motion. Our real mystery isn't how many civilizations came before. It's how we treat the one we have, knowing how thin a layer its traces will be in the rocks of some future age. So here we are, back in the thin slice of time we call now, after everything we've walked through. Certain patterns start to blur together into one shape. Again and again, worlds change when the climate lurches. Sometimes it's a long drought creeping over fields. Sometimes it's ice spreading south, or monsoons shifting just a little too far. Crops fail, rivers shrink, harvests wobble. Empires that thought they were solid find out how much of their power was really just good weather on credit. Again and again, disease slips through the cracks of connection. Fleas on rats in ships, viruses on the breath of travellers, smallpox riding along with trade goods and missionaries, plague in the crowded lanes of a medieval city, or in the streets of Tenochtitlan. The same networks that move grain and ideas also move microbes, and sometimes the microbes win. Again and again, interdependence turns strength into vulnerability. Trade routes that make a region rich also make it fragile. When one link breaks, an invading army, failed harvest, a port destroyed by an earthquake, shock waves run outward, Bronze Age palaces relying on foreign tin, Indus cities tied together by river trade, modern supply chains that can stall over a single closed channel or factory. Then there are the sharp endings. The ones don't need a network or a slow climate shift. Mountain that erupts without asking who lives at its feet. A fault line that slips in the middle of the night. A wave that outruns the horizon. Pompeii, Herculaneum. Coastal towns erased by tsunamis nobody in those centuries had a word for. Climate shocks, disease, interdependence, sudden disasters. Different scales, different tools, different gods and languages. But the same basic lesson, written in different scripts. Nothing we build is guaranteed. That's the sobering version of "we are the seventh civilization." It's also only half the story, because every ending you've just drifted through carries another pattern curled inside it. People adapt. They move. They remember enough to begin again. After glaciers retreat, grass grows back on scraped stone. After a drought, if the rains return, plantings follow the old canals. After pestilence, survivors learn which herbs help, which quarantines work, which rituals to repeat when the next cough starts in the next village. Traders whose sea routes are cut find overland tracks. Farmers whose river changes course learn new crops or new terraces. Cities that fall in one place rise in another, carrying stowaway ideas, brick sizes, measurements, myths, recipes, ways of counting debts and blessings. Even forgetting has its own strange kind of continuity. When a writing system disappears, some of its stories seep into oral tradition. When a temple is buried, its foundations become a convenient platform for the next building. When an empire breaks, its coins, its weights, its words for tax or king sneak into the vocabulary of whoever comes after. History, looked at from far enough away, becomes a slow breathing, build, break, remember a little, build differently. If we call ourselves the seventh civilization, maybe the point isn't to insist on a precise number. Maybe it's to recognize that we are one more turn in that long inhale and exhale, one more arrangement of cities and fields and networks exposed to the same old forces and equipped with the same old stubborn resilience. The rocks remind us that endings can be sharp. The ruins remind us that people keep going. You, lying there listening, are part of that. Your language, your habits, the tools you use without really seeing them. These are all pieces of an experiment that has been running for thousands of years. You inherited it without asking. You'll pass it on in ways you'll never quite see. If you'd like to help this little corner of that experiment keep going, I'll gently ask you to do the usual YouTube things. When you have the energy, you can like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. It helps more than it seems to, and it tells the strange, quiet algorithms that there are people out there who enjoy falling asleep to history. If you feel like sharing right where you're listening from, time it is there right now. A city, a country, or just my bed late. Somewhere, someone else will read it and feel a little less alone in their own night. As you drift toward sleep, you can let the details blur and keep only this. Civilizations rise and they fall. Climates shift, diseases spread, networks fray, volcanoes wake up. But again and again, floodplains and coastlines and high plateaus look at what's left, gather what they remember, start arranging the world into something livable. We don't know how many times that has happened in deep time, or how many more times it will happen in the ages after us. The question that's left to us, in this brief, fragile seventh world, is a soft one you can carry into your dreams. Knowing how easily things break, what gentle, durable pieces of a civilization do we want to tuck into the future? So that, whatever comes next, someone has a little more to build with when the world begins again.